Hello everybody and welcome to the 70th edition of the Frank and Stan chat, and I'm delighted to say we have Rose Marley with us this morning as our guest. Good morning, Rose.
Good morning, thank you for inviting me this morning.
Yeah, and unfortunately we've got my long-standing friend Stan who seems to turn up every week for these with me. How are you this morning, Stan?
It was when the recent edit where you just said the Frank chat started to get me worried. I'm fine.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that to you.
Yeah, I got over my gill scrambling and everything else now, so I'm still aching and still got a cold, but apart from that, I'm fine.
Oh, good. All right. Well, it's good to. I mean, it's actually good for us both to be back in the office, because I was in my car in North Wales, and it's always very tricky with the signal. So I feel much more relaxed about today because it looks as though the signals are really strong. Okay, so Rose, there may well be one or two people who are watching this who have no idea who you are. A small number.
I expect quite a lot.
But you may have seen Rose on Newsnight a couple of months ago. But anyway, Rose, just tell people who you are and how you've got to where you are.
Yeah, well, I am the CEO of Co-ops UK. I'm also the founding director of a social enterprise called Sharp Futures, which is creative, digital and tech talent pipeline. And I am also the chair of the Greater Manchester Social Enterprise Advisory Group and an advisor to SODA, the School of Digital Art. So a lot of what I do does involve the world of education, but not in a traditional, I wouldn't describe myself as a traditional educator.
Yeah, I think I've moved away from a traditional educator as well. But anyway, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for giving us half an hour this morning. Okay, well, we normally kick off with what's caught your eye. So we'll go to Stan first, and then we'll go to you, Rose, if that's okay.
Great.
Go on, Stan.
Well, what's caught my eyes, how you celebrate when, as a former head, when you meet ex-pupils that have done great things. And I had the kind of horrible shock this week doing some CPD for a MAT up in Burnley to be introduced to one of the head teachers who turned out to be an ex-pupil, which makes you feel very old, yes. But also makes you feel quite proud that you've had a positive influence on somebody who's gone into the world of education. And I did a quick check round with my colleagues afterwards, and yes, this ex-pupil is well regarded and doing a good job as a head before I shouted about it. And yes, I did remember him, and I remember because that's the first thing you're asked, aren't you? Do you remember me? But I knew him, I knew his family and everything. And I reflected on how you get that little bit of reflected glory when somebody does really well. And then that was kind of shattered this morning when on Twitter I saw a headline that said serial flasher arrested again, and realised that was another ex-pupil from the same class as the
oh dear. Yeah,
so I suppose you've got to take the good with the bad and say maybe I influenced some and didn't influence others as well as I should have done.
Oh dear. What about you, Rose?
Well, yeah, just picking up on what Stan said as well. I'd forgotten until Stan mentioned it, but I was on Facebook. Somebody posted a picture of my what would have been year 6 junior 4 in old money teacher who, gosh, she must be she's nearly 90. She looks exactly the same, and it took me instantly back, Stan, to a challenge in a way that I expected to deliver for Mrs. Harney, she's called. And it was that point about how you feel when you meet an ex-pupil. It's the same for the pupil as well. You know, it was just a picture on Facebook, and I wanted to tell her, you know, that I had done all the things that I said I was going to do, and I still hadn't stopped talking, but that's become my career now. And I think it's a two-way process, as much as, you know, like you say, you feel a little little bit of reflected glory that you've taken a part in that person's life. You know, absolutely, there's key teachers that I absolutely, you know, attribute some of my thinking to, some of my career decisions to, and it's a really powerful and beautiful thing to be on that journey in somebody's life as an educator, I think.
Well, it's interesting because just to prove this is not prompted or scripted, but we were clearing out a wardrobe this week, and I noticed this program, and I thought, oh, what's that it's from the Northern Ballet Theatre. It's a Christmas Carol, and I opened it to this page because this guy here was a student in the school that I was head teacher of, and his name is Kevin Turner. And so he's the artistic director now of a professional dance theatre company called Chameleon in Manchester. And
Wow.
I reached out to Kevin a couple of years ago. So he has done work for the Co-op Academies Trust with his dancers. And even though I meet him, I haven't met him for a year now, but actually he still sees me as Mr. Norris, you know. So
Yeah.
it's really strange. He was talking to a large group of people, parents, whatever, and students, and he couldn't bring himself to call me Frank. You know, I said, no, you can call me Frank, you can, but actually, you know, those sorts of relationships are fair, you know, it's just so heartening when you think, when he talked about how significant I was, not because of me, but the opportunities that I gave him, inviting Northern Ballet Theatre Company into the school for a week. You know, it's just amazing. It'd be one of those things that I'll take to my grave, really. But anyway,
I had a similar experience outside Tesco, where an ex-pupil with his children and grandchildren, which again doesn't make you feel that much younger than you, said, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson. I said, oh, hi, Paul, nice to see you again. Kind of thing. So, these are my children, these are my grandchildren. I said, oh, very good. Tell them about that goal I scored.
yeah. What's caught my eye this week is how much would you spend? How much do you pay for a bottle of wine? I think this is. I mean, for me, I always sort of think I'm sort of splashing out if I go to £8. I have to say. I think I start to get a bit heady if I get to £9. And before you go down that road, Stan thinks that I'm the tightest person.
No, I don't think it, Frank. I know it.
But anyway, £20 is a very special bottle of wine, you know, for a very special occasion. But it is that's how much that universal credit costs, and just a sense of, you know, the trying to look at current gas prices and trying to our deal runs out at the end of November. When I went onto the EDF website last night, they're basically pushing you to the standard tariff, which I think is an increase of about £800 a year for us. And we're very fortunate. We will not be destitute. We will still be able to eat. We'll still be able to do some nice things. But £20 against that is just, you know, it feels to me like there's a sort of sense that the government is simply out of tune with the vast majority of people in the country. And you know, I think we have spoken many times on this chat about this disconnect between, you know, what reality is and what the policy and where the policy is going, and all of this is just around just a lack of empathy, a lack of sensitivity, and just this sort of desire just to let's just drive on, you know. I mean, it's worked before, it's going to work again, it'll all die down, you know. So I think for me that's caught my eye the whole of this week, and it will continue to catch my eye. Apparently there are queues at petrol stations in London now as everybody tries to fill up a tank of petrol. You know, it's just, you know, I just feel as though this is, you know, we've got a new ministerial team in education. So education news has quietened down a little bit this week from government, but actually it's going to rear up again. You know, this is just about the new ministers, I think.
Yeah. Did you
Yeah, I
see
think
Gary Neville? Did you see Gary Neville on BBC? Which is what his university's doing to try and address poverty, which I thought was very laudable.
So we work with my social enterprise Sharp Futures works with UA92, Gary Neville and some of the class of 92 have set up, and it's fascinating how they're breaking down the barriers about the perceptions of university. And I was at a big event yesterday where the UA92 team were there, and they were back to back with, I'm not sure if it was Manchester University or Manchester Met, but they were all in suits, and then the UA92 were all in the polo shirts and were really young, and just a completely different approach to learning, it not being perceived as a kind of fixed time and space. So they've got modules where you don't have to join the university, the UA92 in September, you can join in January, or you can join in February, you can join the modules. But this bit where the £5,000, that's what was on the newsstand, wasn't it? They put a package together. So that, because again, Our Pass, which is something, a travel card for young people, that's a Andy Burnham mayoral initiative that I also worked on. They're working with Our Pass to make the travel free. They're looking at childcare. They're providing the laptops. And it's really refreshing to see. And what's really refreshing when you work with UA92 is because the funds and the way the money has been provided to create the university, there's not a lot of box ticking. They don't have to meet certain criteria, so they're genuinely doing what's right for the demographic they're trying to reach out to, and genuinely putting together education options that will appeal to that market. So it's really refreshing. I'm watching it with interest to see, how it's taken up, because it really is very different.
I believe that the trust that I used to lead, the one that the Co-op sponsors, that now runs Connell College, but students there have previously not looked at UA92, but many have looked at that this year. So I think I don't really want to quote, because I'm not actually close enough to it, but somebody mentioned that it was in fact the most the chosen university choice for many for students at that college. So. And I think the thing for me is, you mentioned before about the work you've done in digital. When I visited UA92, it feels like a digital business. So the way that they see things and the way that they tackle problems is around, short, sharp sort of activity and review, and then move on. And this idea that you're in suits and whatever, I had that experience as well when I went to UA92. It's actually, I did wear a suit. I did feel very out of it, to be honest. Yeah, we need more like that.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how it unfolds.
So, Rose, you've been on your travels this week, haven't you?
Yeah, I started my week off in Lincolnshire on Monday. So my role as CEO of Co-ops UK is across the whole movement. So there are 7,000 co-ops in the UK, and they do come in all different shapes and sizes. So everything from AR and VR and tech companies and open data companies through to, as we know, retail is a really big dominant sector in the cooperative model space. And again, the retail model is quite misunderstood. And I wanted to spend time with Lincolnshire Co-op, because they're like a £300 million turnover business, and they're not as big as Group. So Group Co-op is the one that you're more familiar with, Frank, but that's the Blue Clover. They supply all the food into the other independent retailers. So across the country, you might have a different cooperative retail experience depending on where you live. But what was fascinating, and they're all different, they're all really different. So
they've got slightly different cultures as well, haven't they?
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to give the impression that, I mean, they all sort of are within this umbrella, but actually there are rivalries and there are challenges, when these cooperatives do come together. So I'm aware of your role here, Rose.
Yeah. And you mentioned Mid-Counties Co-op. So they're doing loads in utilities. They've got like broadband, mobile phone offers, energy offers. whereas Lincolnshire, they're really big in property, particularly in the city of Lincoln, in something called the Cornhill Quarter, which they've completely transformed. They built a cinema space in there, but also they've invested in a science park, which is phenomenally exciting. So there's a strong RAF presence in Lincoln. So they've got a lot of sort of defence companies building up, but they're also focusing on pharmaceuticals. So we spent the day having a look at all the different assets, and one of the things they were building was aseptic labs. And this is about being able to supply pharmaceuticals to the people of Lincolnshire. It was fascinating about how they make the connection as the investment into bricks and mortar, in effect, and the well-being of Lincolnshire. And then again, they had they took us to Mosaic, which is a digital hub that they've got out in Grimsby and places, other areas that they're in within Lincolnshire. They were doing up a parade of shops. So they're really big on property, but they understand the place and people bit. And it's fascinating because I genuinely don't think the general sort of individual on the street understands what cooperatives do in their area. They don't just sell carrots, and it was brilliant. Ursula, who's the CEO there, and David, who's the chair, and I met the board, and they are so passionate about making a difference to the lives of the Lincolnshire people. It was really, really inspiring.
So how healthy is the movement then at the moment?
Yeah, really strong. 40 billion to the UK economy. That's up $1 billion actually on last year. That is a reflection on retail and the pandemic, because local became really, really important. And then you've got, in fact, I'm going to be speaking at the cooperative centre, the Welsh Cooperative Centre, AGM next. They're in growth in terms of how many new co-ops are starting. The big piece really is the resilience. So co-ops have always been really resilient because ultimately the members, whether you're the tenants of a housing co-op or the workers in a freelance co-op, ultimately you make long-term decisions because you are in it for the long term, and that really does produce this resilience piece. It was fascinating to see in the pandemic. So you were 4 times less likely to go under as a co-op throughout the pandemic. That's in our co-op economy report. So yeah, I'd say it's healthy in respect of it's growing in terms of the size of the economy and the numbers of co-ops. But also, I mean, we know this, and you're talking about it there, Frank, with the impact on people's lives, with the way the UK is at the moment. But the pandemic really did shine a light on the inequalities in the UK, and people are looking to be able to have a stake or a say in the way they work, the way they consume, the way they live. So I feel like there's going to be a really big cooperative sort of renaissance around the corner, because people are looking for that distribution of power and distribution of wealth and the equality that the sort of way that you trade as a cooperative brings. So yeah, it's good. It's an exciting time for co-ops.
To me, it's always been around having a voice and having a voice that senior leaders have to listen to. I think that for me has always been a key feature of my knowledge of the co-op. And I think that there are, looking at in terms of what I said before about education policy or government policy, actually you've got to shout very, very, very loud, for ministers to hear. So I think that one of the things I become sort of quite passionate about is looking at the mechanisms by which senior managers in whatever business, and particularly in schools, how do they gather the views of those people that they're serving, and how open is that culture to enable, somebody to actually say something that's quite painful to say and actually painful to hear, and how open is the school or the institution to that type of approach. I remember there was a guy in there that worked for us in the trust, and he was very outspoken. He was very experienced, very able. He had more successful schools behind him than I had, and I genuinely needed to hear the things that he was saying, and at times he would say them in quite a sort of like harsh way, and members of staff would come to me and say, well, shouldn't you be reprimanding him for speaking to you like that, Frank? And I said, no, I need to hear this. I couldn't change the way that he could probably adapt some of the words to be less, sharp, but actually I valued what he was saying, and I wanted people to feel as though they could actually say that to me, in a public way, and not just feel as though you can put it in an email or whatever, you know.
Frank,
Well, that's exactly.
sorry, Rose, I was that's exactly the course we were doing on Tuesday with a multi-academy trust. It's about psychological safety, but the thing you would like about it is it's a development through a company called Spotlight Mindflick that I do a lot of work with. Is they've taken Amazon's view of the empty chair in a meeting, and the empty chair represents that voice that you don't have around the table. So it might be a customer, or it might be somebody who thinks differently. And as a group, you need to then at some point reflect, what would the person in the empty chair be saying to us now when we've decided this? And it's to bring an element of diversity into that thinking,
Right.
not necessarily diversity of upbringing, but diversity of thinking.
Rose, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to build on what Stan said as well, that is what's interesting about the cooperative retail model, because the consumers do get a voice, the consumers own the cooperative, and there's different models as to how that's done, with the consumer councils or the boards themselves being representative. And you know, as you touched on, Frank, there's often heated debates in the co-op movement about the best way to structure some of those things. And one of the things I've heard in the past, so you know, on boards having people with considerable skills, but my big thing is that that's not to the detriment, and should never be to the detriment, of listening to the customer voice, because they are the members, but actually, you know, they are the most expert in being a customer at that shop and in your business. They've got the most valid opinion, in my opinion. And as well, what Stan just said there about diversity of thought, and diversity of upbringing does bring diversity of thought, and this is something that I think is a big challenge for the cooperative movement, because it's not very diverse. When you look at it, you know, at the moment there's a lot of females. Actually, it's really strong on female leadership, but in terms of different geographical areas, to different you know, color of people's skin, we could be doing a lot better in terms of bringing those diverse voices into the movement. Because like say, you know, if you look at something like the artistic and creative communities, often people are operating in a collective, they might call it, rather than a cooperative, and they've given themselves one member, one voice, one member, one vote, and given themselves opportunity for voice, but they don't realise that they're actually got a constitution that they could be working within that will enable that to be even more effective. So I think that's a big challenge, Stan, sort of listening, not just listening to the empty chair, but filling the empty chair.
Yes, it's interesting. I mentioned last week, Stan, that I was doing some work on CEOs and trusts, education trusts, that is, Rose. I basically dug out the 20 largest multi-academy trusts in the country to look at whether or not there were members of the trust who were also trustees. So in effect, and I have to say, of those 20, there are quite a few lords who are both members and trustees. But then I also looked at whether or not the CEO was also a trustee. So, and in all but 2 of the top 20, the CEO has a vote as a trustee, which I think is completely wrong. And I'm going to dig further into this, because I think there's a link between pay rises and that relationship. But the thing for me was I had to go on all of the trust websites to find all this information. So you could see who these trustees and members were. And the thing that strikes you is that they're predominantly men. They were predominantly men. Members there was probably a very, very high chance that you would be a man if you were a member. There were more female trustees, but they were all the same. They looked exactly the same. And really that point, you know, struck me very deeply. And there's probably a bit more work that we need to do about that. But I know that talking about the co-op, but Steve Morels has been sort of quite hot on this, hasn't he? There's been a real review over the last 12 months or so, looking at diversity of thought, diversity of presence within the organisation. So is that replicated in a lot of the other the larger co-ops that you have contact with, Rose?
Yeah, like I say, it's a very much because the independent retailers have got very different, like I say, geographical areas, which the makeup is often sort of dictatorial about what that is. And so what it's never about is kind of just changing the pictures on your website.
Yes.
Although that kind of stuff is important, it's got to be about those deep-rooted, exactly what Stan said, making sure that silent voice is being represented in the decision making, and that is absolutely what all co-ops strive for. I'd say from the wider movement, less about the retail side of things. You see a lot of growth, I'd say, in some of the, you know, the creative industries in particular, or areas like, for example, new growth areas like, you know, digital. And again, that's where I see the opportunity to bring in those diverse voices. And, you know, one of the things that I think gets kind of a little bit overshadowed in diversity is the disability piece as well, and whether that's mental or physical disability. So yeah, it's something that we work hard on at Co-ops UK. We've been doing some work and some research into this, and we've got a kind of DEI inclusion plan that we'll be rolling out into 2022. But I think it's for everybody to consider. It's really easy to put yourself in a bubble. You talked earlier about, you know, the politicians and the lack of empathy they have for the common sort of people. And this lack of empathy, I think empathy is really, really tough. And, you know, when you talked about that, like you said, you know, there's definitely been times in my life where that kind of the price and energy hike would have completely and utterly, you know, possibly sent us bankrupt, you know. And so I've been there at that level of kind of on the breadline. But now I earn a decent wage. Sometimes I have to check myself and remember, because even when you understand it, I think it's hard to remind yourself what it's like for other people. And it's just an exercise that we all need to be doing a lot more, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and really try and empathize. I don't think it naturally always comes to us. I think we have to stimulate empathy, particularly in politicians.
Something else, Rose, that you brought up earlier on, which just to reflect back to schools, you talked about long term and sustainability in the long term that's got the co-op through the pandemic, because they're long-term thinkers. We had somebody on who did what he called cathedral thinking, didn't we, Frank? About his school, talking about 100 years. Where will my school be in 100 years' time? But I do think we're at a point now where schools have to rethink and start to think longer term, and start to say, and the phrase I've used quite often recently is, what sort of school do I want to lead for the next 10 years? And what will it provide in terms of a curriculum, experience? How will it help our pupils or students into the world of work, and the world of work as it's going to be, not how it was in Victorian Britain?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Stan. I was just checking the reference, because it was Ken Robinson, wasn't it, that pointed out the kind of archaic system that we operate in, where we move around to bells and we all sit in lines for an industrialized factory experience that hasn't existed for a long time. And you know sorry, that's our test fire alarm. We're not actually on fire. It'll go off. It'll go off shortly. Apologies, I forgot that happens on a Friday. But what I was going to say was that currently, so I really had hopes the pandemic would push the boundaries on some of the way that we are learning, and that hybrid models of learning and different ways of learning. And I think because the pandemic, you know, obviously sprung on us also quickly, got this really patchy response across the country, where some schools were doing brilliant online lessons. I mean, my children sadly had a really poor experience of just clicking through stuff and not learning and becoming really demotivated, where I saw other children having a great experience. I really would like to see our education system start to reflect the way that we work. And like I say, coming out of creative, digital and tech industries and modern agile workforces, we are really doing our young people a disservice, in my opinion. We're not preparing them for future life in the current system.
I agree entirely with you. And
don't worry, we're going to bring Latin into the curriculum, so that
that'll sort it.
I mean, at the end of the day, there is a I mean, the work I do with the Northern Powers Partnership that is a business organisation. Steve, the co-op are big players in that, and the thing for me is that we seem to have lost the voice of where these children will end up. Education is not, the education system, or to be educated, is not just about going to work. It is a lifelong thing, but for the vast majority of people, they will enter work, and the voice of the business is just not being heard sufficiently well, because every business we speak to, and I speak to the North on the country's largest businesses, they're saying, well, it's not just about GCSEs and A levels they don't regard degrees either.
And Frank, it's not just the element of like you say, it's not just about work. What we're not doing at the moment is teaching our young people how to learn, and we don't fill them with a desire for learning. So like I said, in the pandemic, my children's experience, secondary school children, was just being sent things to click through, that multiple choice that they get right or wrong, and then you get a result at the end of it, and that's what goes on their assessments. They didn't get the opportunity to learn. It would have been amazing to say, you know what, actually we've just got this pandemic, and all of a sudden, particularly the year 11s that weren't doing GCSEs, imagine if they'd been given, right, okay, we want you to go and choose a subject matter of your own choice, relate it into what you're doing. It would have been amazing opportunity. And I completely understand how the education system works and isn't designed to be agile and flexible like that. And there is a real key point about childcare, when we talk about all this kind of the potential, but if you're looking at the way that businesses operate in increasingly agile ways, and it's about results achieved, not the hours put in. This sort of like presenteeism is a big thing in the workplace. But like I say, if you encourage a love of learning and inquisition and all those wonderful attributes that we could be giving at reading, actually the other stuff will come, because tech's really going to enable us. It's really intuitive. You don't need to learn a lot of tech. It's just there. You click, and if it's for young people, if there's more than 3 clicks, they're not going to go any further anyway. So I just think we're missing the point at the moment in education. We're not generating a generation of young people who are passionate about learning. They are passionate about passing exams, which is entirely different subject matter.
That's the point, because
the point,
I would say that the workforce in education is agile, and it is ambitious, and it's ambitious for all those things. But as long as you only test them by certain criteria that aren't part of that exciting curriculum, then you're stuck. And it goes back a long time to when inspection was the big threat. I suppose it still is. But schools would say, we're going to develop our curriculum, but not until we've had our next inspection. Once we've got that out of the way, we can start
do the proper stuff.
Creative things.
But to me, I often use is a sausage making machine. We're producing very bland, dull sausages out of this system. And actually, we just need to put a lot more, think about what the ingredients are and make it much spicier and much more interesting. We're nearly at the end here, believe it or not. We've had over 30 minutes. But I was reminded this week that the computing GCSE, you have to handwrite your answers. That summed it up for me. That summed it up, that something that was actually meant to be assessing your digital skills relies on your ability to have decent handwriting.
And presumably spelling and punctuation.
Well, we can go down that road. I mean,
give me something positive. Tell me something you learned this about education.
No,
we can't.
I have got some good news, because for me, in the work I do in Blackpool, the council has paid for the last 2-3 years for an external agency to assess the students' ability in years, I think it's 7, 9 and 11. So yesterday we got the results for the summer just gone assessments, and there has, according to those results, and I've got to be careful because it's still not in the public domain, but there is no apparent learning loss in the reading and mathematics areas of those assessments. The loss is in their attitudes, because they assess the attitudes of the students. So there's a question, 50 questions they have to answer. So those young people, their performance is very similar to previous years, but their attitude and their feeling of worth is much lower. So it's not that they have had this sort of learning loss. They're in effect, and we're not quite sure whether it's they actually feel less supported or whatever, or whether it's just nationally everyone's convinced everybody else that this been catastrophic. I think the young people have been very resilient and they've worked hard to try and keep themselves on track. Even if they've had a poor experience of learning at home, they've got back and they've got down to it. The vast majority of them have. So I'm optimistic about that. Certainly for Blackpool. I don't know about the rest of the country, but bearing in mind, that's probably the most deprived, if not the second most deprived area in the country. To get those sorts of results is worth telling the world about, and certainly worth telling the young people in Blackpool about, to make them feel as though you can do this. You've done really well.
I was speaking to a head about all this catch-up stuff, and he was just saying, if I get a student come in now from another school, I don't start to say how much learning loss have they had or where are they. We assess where they are and we press on. And why aren't we just doing that rather than creating a monster called catch-up that doesn't? Well, I would agree. I'd hope that data shows that, but my thoughts are there's not been that much loss over learning, but loss over physical ability, and
creative stuff as well,
ability, and creative stuff,
and also emotional stuff. Just being able to talk and chat to people.
And the head that where I'm a governor has noticed it in physical stuff where they do, I don't think they do the mile a day thing, but they do activities like that. And he said the difference, so 18 months on, is significant. And things like swimming, because they've not been swimming for 2 years. And so they're way behind on things like physical things like that. And as you say, Frank, emotional things.
Rose, we're going to finish there, but do you want to end up with a positive?
Well, annoyingly, all I could think of was the negative of those, particularly those young people that didn't do the GCSEs and their A levels, and really didn't get to say goodbye to the teachers, the school, the friends, and grieving. And so I guess I've turned it positive to say, that's what, a challenge to us all, to, that lost generation. In fact, the Co-op group did a piece called The Ghosted Generation recently. And just to kind of appeal to all your listeners, if you've got young people like that in your life, just to listen to them, back to Stan's point, just to listen to them and see how they are feeling. And you might be able to do something to help, and you might not be able to, but listening will certainly make them feel a little bit better.
Well, on a positive note, the group of 60 year sixes that I was out in outdoor education were a fantastic example of polite and enthusiastic and willing young people. They lifted my spirits, I'll say that.
Yeah, I've always felt more optimistic about our young people taking the country forward than I have always felt about the adults. So I'm sure that's the case. So thank you all for watching. That's amazing. I mean, it's nearly 40 minutes, believe it or not. It just rattles past. So thank you, Rose. Thank you very much for joining us, and all being well. We have guests again next week. So it'll be Frank, Stan and guests next week. But thank you very much, Rose. And we'll see you all next week, all being well.